Merci, Catherine, pour cette introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us on this Renewables to End Energy Poverty for a Sustainable and Inclusive World panel with a very nice group of people that I will introduce you in a moment. It's a privilege for me to be moderating this session because we all know that the lack of access to affordable, reliable, and renewable energy is trapping millions in poverty, worsening food security, undermining efforts to address climate change, and exacerbating inequalities and gender gaps, all elements that will prevent us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals agenda for 2030. It is crucial, I believe, that we work to overcome obstacles and take advantage of opportunities to solve energy poverty and reduce inequalities worldwide. Think just of green growth as a mechanism for recovery out of the pandemic. Currently, 840 million people don't have access to electricity worldwide. 55% of them are located in sub-Saharan Africa. And if we maintain the same pace of investment in 2030, we still have 650 million people that are without electricity. It's a tremendous opportunity to explore this global transition to renewable. Such a transition promises significant potential ripple effect benefits from improved education, economic development, and job creation to better public health, gender equality, and food security. So today's session promised to be quite exciting. And please use also the chat function to post your Q&A, your question, and we'll try to find the best answer to them. And I'm reminding you that this session is available in French and English. So today, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker. First, Marc-André Blanchard, Executive Vice President and Head of Caisse Dépôt et Placement du Québec Global, present in over 65 countries, 390 billion in asset, and a return on asset that is, for the last 10 years, over 8%, not neglectable. Welcome, Marc-André. And Marc-André, before joining CDPQ Global, was our ambassador and permanent representative from 2016 to 2020 to the United Nations in New York. I must say that he was not only our ambassador and permanent representative, but he was an excellent one with whom I had the opportunity to collaborate. Welcome, Marc-André.
Merci beaucoup. Bien, thank you very much for those generous words.
I also have on stage with us in Montreal, Laurie Kerr, who is the CEO of FinDev Canada. FinDev is a key contributor to inclusive international development financing, offering innovative solutions that have a sustainable impact. She has more than 2 decades of international development leadership experience with a specialization in sustainable infrastructure, climate change, and private investment in emerging markets. Welcome, Laurie.
Merci beaucoup.
And our last panelist joining us from Dubai today is Josephine Wapakabulo. She is the CEO of the consultancy TIG Africa that look at sustainability and profitability for startup and businesses in Africa, which is not a country, a continent with 54 countries. She is an electrical engineer and business executive who previously served as the founding CEO of the Uganda National Oil Company in 2016, starting in 2016 to 2020. Together, dear panelists, you represent a tremendous diversity and depth of experience. We are fortunate to have you with us today. But let's launch our conversation by asking you exactly the same question, and I'll start with Laurie, followed by Marc-André and Josephine. What are the greatest obstacles and most exciting opportunities facing a global transition to renewable energy? Laurie, please.
Merci beaucoup. It's a pleasure to be here, Marc-André. It's wonderful to see you again. And Josephine online, it's lovely to see you again as well. So I love this question. Let me start with the upside in terms of opportunity. So at FinDev Canada, as Canada's development finance institution, we work with the private sector in our target markets of Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean to support private investment, to improve economic opportunities and help our countries and our clients grow. In terms of renewable energy, we see tremendous opportunity. Jean, you mentioned in your opening remarks the tremendous opportunity there is. Depending on the data points, there's somewhere between 760 and 1 billion people without access to electricity, as you said. And this represents an enormous opportunity to serve these these people with lack of access. In addition, developing countries, as we know, aren't contributing to greenhouse gas emissions as much as industrialized countries. So at FinDev Canada, we see this also as an opportunity to support communities and to support countries, not only to leapfrog or, bypass fossil fuel dependence, but also decrease dependence on fossil fuels. I think in terms of opportunities, we also see opportunities across the spectrum, from large-scale, grid-connected, distributed generation, mini-grids, all the way down to solar home systems. So in terms of opportunities, it's ample. It's really incredible. Every one of those consumers that don't have access to electricity really represents an opportunity for investment. However, with all of this wonderful investment potential in renewable energy, we also have to be mindful that there are certainly risks, particularly in the markets that we work in. In emerging markets, it's not a risk-free environment. I would say one of the biggest challenges that we face, that I face at FinDev Canada, is in terms of managing the risks associated with investments in emerging markets. I would say top of the list are looking and managing challenging legal frameworks and regulatory environments. And in general, there's a lack of investable opportunities. We hear this a lot when we talk to investors about lack of bankable opportunities. I'll give you a couple of examples. In Africa, there's again lots of opportunity as you've said from the data. And what we're finding is, challenging regulatory frameworks, challenging legal frameworks. We see off-takers that necessarily don't have the financial wherewithal to stand behind opportunities, and generally just a complicated investment environment. So we're looking at sort of macro-level issues, sector-level issues, and then sort of commercial opportunity issues. So these are some of the challenges. Even in Latin America and the Caribbean, where renewable energy is generally has had a longer track record, we see that the return on debt and equity is a little bit less than one would kind of expect in working in emerging markets. So that faces additional challenges to mobilizing investment. Having said that, that's why we're here. That's why we are Canada's development finance institution, is to help private sector investment both within the markets that we partner with, the markets that we operate, as well as bring in foreign investment. So we're focusing on the opportunity side of the equation and trying to manage the challenges the best.
Thank you, Laurie. And just as complimentary, would you know approximately what is the portfolio that you have under the Renewable overall with the FinDev?
Sure. So we have sort of three sectoral areas that we focus on. Green growth is one of those, and the green growth portfolio writ large is about a third, I would say, of our portfolio.
Good. Thank you very much. Marc-André, c'est quoi les obstacles? What are the obstacles, and what are also the exciting opportunity when you look at CDPQ Global, but also your own experience?
Well, thank you very much, Jean. I'm very happy to. Thanks for La Conférence de Montréal for inviting us today, and it's a great panel. And thank you for Laurie and Josephine to join me. And you, what I want to say first, before I get into answering your question, I want to do a big advertisement for Laurie. So I want to say first, Laurie is the new CEO of FinDev Canada. I want to welcome you to the beautiful city of Montreal. And Laurie had just told me that she moved with family and young children and is enjoying it so far. So to all of you who are thinking about moving to Montreal, just talk to Laurie.
Absolutely.
We're starting a movement here. But seriously, what I want to say about FinDev Canada is it's actually a new development finance institution. It was created in 2016. It is something that is very, this is at the heart of what we're going to be discussing today. And the role of FinDev Canada in this is key. If Canada wants to be a serious player in actually making sure that we actually reduce the number of people without energy in sub-Saharan Africa or in other parts of the world, we will need players like FinDev Canada. And each country that that as a role globally as a development financial institution, the only thing is that most countries of our size, their development finance institution has capital that is probably 10 times the size of FinDev Canada. So I want you to think about it. Maybe there's an election campaign in Canada. Maybe we can ask parties to actually commit to increase the funding, because it's important. It's going to be important for all sorts of reasons that we're going to talk about. But I mean, I'm talking about the relevance of Canada in what we need to be doing, because Canada has this is a phenomenal opportunity. All of this, this race towards renewables in the world. It's needed for climate change. It's needed to fight inequalities. That represents by itself a phenomenal opportunity for Canadians and for Quebecers, because we are a world leader in this issue. So until 2030, it is expected that we will double the renewables production in the world. And so each time there's a new field of solar, or there's a new field of windmills created, this is an opportunity for us, because we have the technology, we have the financiers, we have the engineers, we have the knowledge and the experience. So I really believe that this is a huge opportunity for us. It's about doing the right thing for the planet. It's about making sure that it creates economic growth in parts of the world where it's really needed, where it makes the difference between conflicts and no conflicts, between a lot of migration in Western Europe and less migration. It's all of that we're talking about when we're talking about renewable energy in sub-Saharan Africa, or in some other parts of the world where it is also needed to decarbonize the planet. So that's the opportunity in a nutshell. For me, the obstacles are, and we'll be talking about that today. And the obstacles are the same that you would think in a normal, deal setting or economic setting, except, of course, the issue of frontier markets. So we all tend to overestimate a risk that we don't know and underestimate the opportunities. And we need to be careful. So there's a big asymmetry of information about the markets we're talking about the instruments that are available to help us in going into these markets. So that's one thing. It seems benign, but it's a big obstacle. The second obstacle is the issue of the lack of bankable project. We need to make sure there's a pipeline of project that is bankable, and that what we mean by that, it's actually sometimes the scale of projects that does not fill the global finance requirements. Sometimes it's a question of vocabulary, taxonomy. It's a question of legal framework. It's an issue. So a lot of people, and there's a huge market failure there, and we'll talk about that later. And so some people need to roll up their sleeves and actually go deeply into these issues. So asymmetry of information, lack of bankable projects. The issue of returns is an issue. It was mentioned by Laurie. And the question of risk. Risk is also an issue. But as I said to you, the information will help diminish the assessment of the risk, but there's a risk that will remain, that is high, and that needs to be compensated in some ways. So these are some of the obstacles that I see. But the good thing is that there's a huge alignment of capital towards sustainable development, in particular, renewable energy. And so the issue is not lack of capital. There's no lack of capital, but the obstacle make it difficult to deploy.
Merci, Marc-André. Thank you very much. I told you he was not only the ambassador, he was an excellent ambassador. And if ever I move to Montreal, I hope that I will share a podium with Marc-André back to my hometown. But for the moment, let's move to Josephine and ask her exactly the same question. What are the greatest obstacles in your book, as well as the most exciting opportunity for global transition to those renewables?
Well, thank you, Jean. It's a pleasure to join this panel, and I feel honored to be talking with Laurie and Marc-André. I think they've very adequately sort of covered the opportunity side, and you did it in your opening remarks. I think we know that renewable energy provides great opportunity on energy access, getting to those people in sort of the more decentralized, off-grid opportunities, innovation, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa. There's been a lot of linkage with renewable energy and mobile money and mobile technology. So the opportunity is clear and not in question. So I'll just sort of elaborate on some of the points raised around the challenges. And particularly for me, on the financing challenge that has been raised by both Laurie and Marc-André, as they both said, the issue isn't finance. I mean, I think the Western governments, the developed governments, have committed $100 billion a year to developing economies to help with the energy transition. Now, the last reports I saw, about 20 billion of that has been dispersed. And sub-Saharan Africa alone needs $100 billion a year, or $100 to $120 billion a year to even realistically hit some of the targets set in 2030. So this disparity between having capital and disbursing the capital effectively, and its various issues like regulatory policy, infrastructure, the structures to disperse the money locally, local tax policy, local banking policy, it gets quite complex. So we need to find ways where we can address that challenge of dispersing the capital required to actually transition. The other point that is very real that I see very much every day in some of the companies that I'm helping to build and some of the groups that I'm working with is even when you have the capital, you have the pipeline, you have the projects, our supply chain lead times cannot often meet our ambitions. And to make that real, we're saying for particularly things like battery storage, you can wait months. And we don't have the luxury of months when you look at the scale, you're looking at 600 million people, you're looking at a lot of people in energy poverty globally, and lead times for a lot of the critical assets or raw materials we need, because demand is growing exponentially, which on one level is very good. It shows that this sector is growing. But right now, what I'm seeing from a lot of the projects I'm involved in or different sort of environments where we're having this discussion, how do we match up this acceleration and this need to scale and do things at speed when our supply chains, our raw material manufacturing, processing supply chains for critical assets for this sector are actually not lining up. And so that's something I feel is a challenge that we should be exploring more, and we'll discuss more through the evening.
Thanks, Josephine. And, I take note of, the risk. I take note of the alignment of capital. I take note of the ambition and the challenge at the level of the value chain. And I'm going to come back to Marc-André on this, because from my standpoint, you were mentioning FinDev. I see FinDev as one of the three parts of the international development institution in Canada. IDRC being on the research side, trying to feed research that brings project ready for investment to FinDev, and Global Affairs that play the overall coordination work there. But what have you seen, and what is your experience, Marc-André, on how the philanthropy, let's take Rockefeller, for example, that has a huge program on energy, the government, the development agency, and other sector, private sector, allowing for the financing infrastructure, technical capacity, system necessary to be better in ending this energy poverty. So the coordination impact.
So that's an excellent question. I'll answer. I want to make one more comment on the last question for Canadians to realize the role of Canadians in renewables. La Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec is amongst the top 3 investors in infrastructure in the world, amongst the top 5 investors in renewables in the world. And some of the other players in the top 5, let's say, of renewable infrastructure world are Brookfield, are CPPIB, Teachers. So it's a palmarès. It's a chart like a top that is actually filled by Canadian institutions. And so to be, so we're a world leader in renewables in Canada, not only because of the pension funds, as I said, because of the engineers and because of the rest. I can say I come from the legal industry. I know the legal industry as the best talent in the world on the renewables in this country. So, and we have this experience with public-private partnership that very, very few countries have. Do you know that in the United States of America, only 20 states have the legal framework for public-private partnerships? So imagine in the rest of the world. So it is a very it's a skill set that we need to leverage now, actually, for us to be relevant in the world. Now your question, it's about platforms. I agree with you. There's but we need, Sophie Brochu, the CEO of Hydro-Québec, I really like what she said, this is a time that calls for us to put the usual paradigms of competition aside. This is completely, like, if we want to succeed to get out of this pandemic, to actually fight effectively against inequalities and win our fight against climate change, we need to think about the world differently and also of the ecosystem differently. So to me, it's all about, let's sit down, roll up our sleeves, and do things differently and bring what we can bring to the table. I'll give you one example. I saw a few weeks ago that BlackRock came out with a fund of $500 million. For BlackRock, this is a very small fund. I accept that. But it's a sign of the time. They came up with a fund of $500 million to invest in renewable mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And in that fund, their partners, who are their partners? 2 DFIs like FinDev Canada, the DFI in France and in Germany. So the 2 DFIs are guaranteeing that they're going to take the first loss. And BlackRock is actually proposing to invest that much money. They're looking for partners now in the fund. But this is so innovative. The fact that a year ago you would have said that BlackRock would partners with some DFIs, and I think if I remember well, the Swedish Foreign Aid Agency is part of that. Like, to have that combination would have been on top of. Everybody would have said it's impossible. We will not see that. But, and we will certainly not see that in the United States of America. But, well, they did it. So my point, it's changing completely. What we need to change, I'm actually very active at the moment at the World Bank with the sustainable market initiatives of Prince Charles, who has been focusing on this issue for the last 40 years. Really kudos to him. And the CEO of Bank of America, who is co-chairing the sustainable market initiatives with him. We're meeting on Friday with Janet Yellen and the president of many of the multilateral development banks to tell them, listen, and we carried that message to the G7 leaders in June in Cornwall. We were 9 leaders from the business community with Prince Charles and Brian Moynihan saying to the business community, listen, there's to the leaders of the G7, there's enough capital out there. You just need to help us with the proper legal policy framework, and you also need to help us to de-risk ourselves in some markets. If you want us to go to frontier markets, if we all think it's as a geopolitical strategy issue, it's an issue we want to do, and I think the answer is yes. We need to think about it differently, but then you need to change the Washington institution and the MDBs around the world need to think differently about their role. So they need to see what I've told you about the issues. It's asymmetry of information. It's the issue of the risk. So we need from these multilateral development banks, and I'm ending, Jean, is the issue of we need to them to help us with first loss products that are easy to use, that are at scale. The other part, and speedy, that they act with more speed. The World Bank needs to understand that it is not the leader in this financing exercise, that they need to change their role and become the supporter of the private sector and the institutional sector to get there. When the World Bank was created 70 years ago, there was no institutional sector. Now we represent $100 trillion. So we need to find a way to leverage part of that to accomplish what you're doing. So I'll finish on that. I had a discussion a few months ago with someone very, very high at the World Bank. I won't identify who. The first question was, are institutional investors willing to sacrifice their returns to do good in the world? Well, this is the wrong question. This is not the right question at all. So there's need to change the mindset there. The question that needs to be asked by the World Bank to institutional investors is, how can we go together? What instruments are needed for you to invest? And how can we de-risk yourself, help you understand better the market, share data that we have and our knowledge of the market, and create those platforms. And then we're going to succeed.
Merci, Marc-André. Thank you very much. But I'm going to follow on that thread for Laurie and Josephine to come in, because, you mentioned the asymmetry of information. You mentioned the needs for platform. I'm going to question the receptivity of the officials to change the policy and the legal framework in their country in order to seize those opportunities. And Laurie, I'll start with you, but I'll ask also Josephine to comment on this. Is there a willingness through the interaction you have with developing country leadership and policymaker for accepting to change the legal framework in order to favor those investments?
Sure. Thanks so much, Sean. It's a really great question. And so much of what Marc-André said just resonates. And I couldn't agree more that it's a renewed public-private partnership, or a different type of public-private partnership that's needed in a global basis. And as part of the ecosystem that Marc-André was referring to, we have multilateral development banks, we have the regional development banks, we've got the development finance institutions in the private sector, and lots of sort of shades in between, if you will. And certainly as we look at every institution's role in the ecosystem with the multilateral development banks and the regional development banks that work with governments and do the government lending and provide capacity building and support to governments, indeed, that's where we're laying the foundation and the frameworks within which private sector investment will ultimately flourish down the line. But it starts really far upstream. And that's really where the MDBs and some of the bilateral agencies that focus on that type of upstream work with governments is absolutely critical. We can't expect the private sector to sort of come in at the end and then through sort of like structuring transactions or platforms, have them deal with all the risks. No. The risks need to be dealt with up front through good sector planning, through good economics, good macroeconomics, et cetera. So there certainly is a role for the multilateral development banks and the bilateral agencies with working with governments and enhancing and improving all of the enabling frameworks that support investment. And then there's the other sort of part of the ecosystem where the DFIs sit, like FinDev Canada and some of our peer institutions and the private sector wings of the multilateral development banks that really focus on supporting private investment. And I want to make a distinction. It's trying to bring more foreign investment into markets, going back to one of Marc-André's data points, of the trillions of dollars that are invested in infrastructure, less than 1% of that is in an emerging market. So just imagine if we could turn that dial a little bit through some of the innovative examples that has been illustrated today. So what we do is we support international investment as well as supporting domestic investment. And we shouldn't forget about domestic investors as well and the role of domestic capital in emerging markets. And that's what FinDev Canada is here, is to support the private sector investment in green growth and other sectors. But it's a really, really important opportunity set for us. And then at the other end, as Marc-André said, it's private capital. And I believe that it's important to recognize the constraints, the binding constraints, and the fiduciary responsibility that institutional investors in particular have to their shareholders. And that's okay. And that's exactly what you're saying. Our role should be further up the food chain, with the role of DFIs to support and MDBs to support the private investment, and then even further upstream for the agencies to work with government. So again, I think it's an entire ecosystem approach that really needs to be taken, and not looking at each individual piece of that ecosystem, but really bringing it together. So again, a lot of what Marc-André said, I think really resonates in that particular aspect. One other role of the development finance institutions, which may be sort of clear for everyone, but I certainly wanted to make the point, is that in addition, for those of us that are commercially oriented and we provide our investments, whether it's debt or equity, on commercial terms, our role here is not to displace private capital, but really to complement it. Some of the other aspects that we look at are really around the development impact. And are these investments really truly having a positive development impact for the communities and for the people on the ground? So from FinDev Canada's perspective, we look at a number of different dimensions, including women's economic empowerment, including climate action, as well as market development. And I can get into a couple examples later on of some of how we've looked at some of the investments that we've made in our regions, in our target regions, that focus on that. But maybe I'll leave that there for now.
Provide one example now, Laurie, and we'll go to Josephine, and I'll remind the audience, bring your question in if you have any for our panelists. So finish up with one example, Laurie, and we'll move to Josephine afterwards.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And this is on the smaller scale of the spectrum. Remember I said there's opportunities from large-scale grid connected all the way to solar home systems. So on the smaller end of the spectrum, we've invested in a company that many of you may be familiar with called Mkopa. It's a Kenyan solar system pay-as-you-go company. And in terms of from the women's economic empowerment agenda that we focus on, there's more than 300,000 women customers of the organization. More than 50% of the labor force, more than 40% of the sales force are all women. There's women in management. More than 50% of the users are actually women. They've recently introduced a new product, solar fridges, and they actually took into consideration the needs of women in the design of that product, so it would satisfy the needs of this target market. So by really focusing on the opportunity of women, both on sort of three different spectrums, one in management, second as employees, and third as clients or consumers of the electricity or of the products, they've really opened up a whole new market. We're thrilled with this investment. There's a lot of space for them to grow. And that's just like one example, just from the women's economic empowerment lens that we bring to our investments that's really important to us.
Thanks, Laurie. And Josephine, what is the receptivity of government policy actor and willingness to change, whatever needs to be changed in order to favor the development of these, projects that change life and livelihood of peoples?
I mean, I think the evidence is on the ground. There's close to 300 to 400 different types of companies, whether they're working in wind or solar or other sort of bioenergy across the continent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. We're seeing a lot of governments moving towards very receptive policy, fiscal sort of targets, and there's funding available to support governments and people working on that side of the space. I think and Laurie sort of very well described the different sort of funding that's available to enable that. So I've seen a very strong responsiveness from governments who want to see energy access accelerated, who see the opportunity with renewable energy. But going back to something that Marc-André said about doing things differently, and I hear a lot of conversation about the endpoint, the solar, the projects, But going back to my point about supply chains and tying it back to infrastructure, most of the raw materials for this sector sit in Africa. Most of the mining of that raw material, whether it's 60% of the world's cobalt sitting in DRC, or some of the other fundamental raw materials and minerals are sitting in Africa. We're seeing vast amounts of mining taking place, and wanting to learn and do something differently. I'm not seeing enough conversation about how do we bring some of that supply chain in Africa? Why don't we do more of the investment in the processing steps that happen in Africa? Why don't we see that would be jobs, that would be income, that would be infrastructure, that would be power? So you're actually dealing with multiple levels of problems. So I think some of this, if we don't address it differently, to Marc-André's point, or open ourselves to look at it differently, we're basically reinforcing colonialism, but wrapping it around with green colonialism. In certain, environments where I'm sitting, that's what it's starting to feel like. Why don't we start holistically addressing this problem by saying, through the whole ecosystem, from the whole value chain right to the end point, where can this money be invested? Where does policy, fiscal, governance need to be addressed? Where are the risk points? But at the same time, addressing energy poverty, addressing these inequalities in a way that's pragmatic, long-term, and also realign some of the inequities that we see today.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree with you here because, at IDRC, I'm there for 25 years now, and I've seen over and over this asymmetry of information between, the funders and the national authorities. And how many times in my career did I have to take my pilgrim stick and say, listen, there are capacities. There are researchers in Africa. There are researchers in Latin America and Asia that are on par with the Canadian, the US, or the European. And I think this asymmetry of information is not only, when it comes to the finance, but globally when we tackle development. We need to take into consideration the local voices in the field. And not only listen, but act with them. And I think there's a little bit of shift of paradigm, to use, Sudanese terms, in terms of development agency, listening also to development, not being only for the sake of development, but being opportunity for growth and business development. And at IDRC, we have research on that. It's a journey because it asks for people to change themselves within an organization and then, to trust people in the field. Now, I see time running by. I don't see question, but, I'm going to give you each an opportunity to tell me what success will look like in 1 year and in 10 years with what you have been saying about the opportunity and the obstacle. How would you measure success, Josephine? I'll start with you, go to Laurie, and end up with Marc-André.
That's an excellent question. For me, success will be more platforms and environments where we actually have pragmatic solutions that recognize that we are not all starting at the same point in this journey. We all know the end point. We know the goals, 2030, 2050. It's very well articulated. We've established this good funding. Funding is getting smarter, cleverer, more mature, more available, policy shifting. But what I often feel is not often discussed enough, I don't see enough platforms where we have the deliberate debate and action around how do we ensure for those who benefited from coal and oil and gas for centuries in some instances and have developed very fast from that, how do we, for a new sector in renewables, it's relatively new and growing, but not growing at the pace we want. How do we ensure the transitions that need to happen for the more developed economies, the emerging and the developing? How do we ensure that as we all transition to the ultimate goal, success for me would look like accepting that those transitions will look different, that we acknowledge they need to look different, that we factor in some different ways of approaching it by region, and also make sure the funding is available and dispersed much faster. So for me, it's finding more equity in the journey to the transition and also getting funding dispersed equitably as well.
Thank you very much. Laurie, in 2 minutes.
Great. No, that's a fabulous response, Josephine. I'll try and build on that. So I agree with everything you said. I think Success from my vista, what would that look like? I think is part of the transition to a greener economies throughout the world in a very tailored fashion, as Josephine was mentioned, but also ensuring that that's done in an inclusive manner, that no one is left behind, and particularly from our view, women and girls are brought along as part of that growth prospect. Are we ensuring that there's quality employment, that products and services are viewed through a gender lens? So I think that that's part of it. I think the ultimate goal, frankly, from a development finance perspective, is to work ourselves out of a job because money is flowing. You know, that 0.67% of institutional investment money is flowing into emerging markets and making the investments that are necessary without the need of development finance institutions to provide additional information and to provide risk mitigation and what have you. That's a longer term goal, and probably, odd to say, sitting in a development finance institution, that we want to, work ourselves out of a job. But ultimately, I think that we need to bring the financing, bring the skills, the capabilities, and the financing to the table to pave the way so that, Marc-André will be sitting here 10 years from now with only private sector investors looking back saying how fabulous this go has been.
Merci, Laurie. Marc-André.
Well, I totally agree with what Josephine and Laurie said. And for me, success looks like, let's say, in 2030, because I am convinced that on renewables, the money is going there quickly. So I think actually this will actually be a success story. I really believe so. Because there's so much money available for energy and renewable in this world. Just think about all of the big, Shell and BP and others that are actually now amongst the biggest investors in renewable. And then think about all of the American funds that have been raised, like TPG and Canadian Brookfield raised. They both together, if you add them, both funds, I think it's close to $13 billion for transition, and a lot of it is in renewables in some ways. So there's a real acceleration there. So I'm not concerned about the renewables. I think it's going to be a huge success. Where I would think it's a success is that we would have used renewables to actually get institutional players like CDPQ more comfortable in some frontier markets, so that we have now invested and developed solid partnerships with other institutional players in those countries. To answer Josephine's point, I mean, there's a pension fund in South Africa that is almost the size of the CDPQ, and you know what? They have 98% of their assets invested in Africa, and I think their returns is somewhere between 8 and 10% year after year. So it is a very so we need. But the problem at the moment is we have no experience as investors in some markets, in some frontier markets. So we need to enter, and I think the door is climate and renewables, and after that, it's going to go in all sorts of other things. I was one of the behind the idea of Canada's co-chairing the Blue Economy Conference in Kenya 3 years ago. Everybody at the time when I suggested it said, "Are you out of your mind? We're going to co-chair. Canada will co-chair an international meeting like this summit." Not in Canada. I said, yes, that's called the new kind of partnership we need. So the government bought into it. And then we did it. And some people said, oh, there will be nobody attending. You'll see, and there will be no interest in sustainable development. You know what? Everybody expected 1,000 people. 18,000 people showed up in Nairobi for this Blue Economy Conference. Who showed up? Young entrepreneurs. What were they looking for? Young entrepreneurs from Canada to do business with. That's what we need to be getting to. And that's what would success look like, is actually in 5 years, we get our entrepreneurs from Canada solidly connected with entrepreneurs from all sorts of frontier markets, starting with in our own hemisphere here, down south, and some corners, and obviously in Africa, because Canada, it being from the Commonwealth and from la francophonie, we have a huge advantage and the trust level is high, and we have real friends both in Latin America, in Africa, and in some parts of Southeast Asia, and that's how we should start doing business and answering and fighting inequalities and climate change. So
merci,
that's my view.
Merci beaucoup. We have friends and you are friends of the Conférence de Montréal. I thank you, the three of you, for bringing such important information and insight in this conversation and showing the way that Canada and others, like Josephine, can make a huge contribution towards this journey. And I think also thinking outside of the box in terms of global cooperation. It's a pleasure for us to be a partner of the Conférence de Montréal. At IDRC, we strongly believe that those spaces provide opportunity for thinking, but also for acting. Thanks to the Rémillard family, Nicolas, for organizing this. And let me take this final moment to convene you on behalf of IDRC. We have one session tomorrow on care economy with our Executive Vice President, Dominique Charon. As well, I will entertain a fireside chat with the new Chief Scientist of the Food and Agriculture Organization tomorrow at lunchtime. So thank you very much, Marc-André, Laurie, Josephine. It has been fantastic to be, moderating you. Very disciplined, fantastic. And thanks to the audience for attending the session. Au revoir et à très bientôt.
Merci, thank you.